All right, Matthew, thank you for joining us on the Show Me the Data podcast. Really excited to have you here to break down how you did your first webinar and were able to drive $300,000 in pipeline in the first go at it. So as we dive in, let's get right into the data. Walk us through what the goal of the webinar was for you. Was it educational, sales driven? When you set out, what was the initial thought?
Yeah, well, thanks very much for having me on the show, Alex. It's great to join you today. So the goal of this webinar for us was really to do two things. One, it was to provide overarching education to our customers and also to our prospects, and also to sort of test the waters in relation to running a webinar format. It's something we hadn't traditionally focused on, and in light of the current circumstances, we wanted to give it a good go. So, yeah.
That makes sense. So as you started out, you mentioned that there's an educational component to it, along with a little bit of a sales led and trying to educate the market that wasn't part of your customer base. How are you determining who to target within? Was it account based? Was it title based? Walk us through a little bit of the parameters that you were using.
Yeah, so for this webinar, we took a fairly broad approach. We really wanted to use it as a way to sort of grow the awareness of the Labelbox brand and sort of our position as a leader in the training data platform category. So we focused on our broader list initially in HubSpot. So this is comprised of people that have downloaded content from us before, they've signed up for our free tier. They may be existing customers or prospects in our pipeline to date. And we paired that with some prospecting targeting across Facebook and LinkedIn to people in our ICP, which are generally data science related functions with seniority of manager and above, and specifically of companies that are running or actively considering data science related projects.
Got it. And this was right when, in the middle of April, so when people were working from home in full stretch. So you had a couple of other tools that you were using along with, you had your SDRs reaching out, but then you also paired that with another tool. Is that?
Yeah, so we ran an email marketing campaign. It was a 3-touch email marketing campaign. The first email out to our audience was just a very basic personalization with name. In the subject line, we essentially told people that they could learn more about building AI apps with Labelbox. It was product centric. So the first touch was very simple, straight link to the registration page. People could fill it in, tracked it with UTMs and so forth, so we knew the source. The next touch was sort of in the same week as the webinar, so we sort of increased the urgency a little bit and gave people a bit of a push. So very similar messaging. And then the final touch was a day before the webinar. It was sort of like a last chance. It said, register now. This is your chance to participate. Join us live, ask your questions, and really become a part of it. So, and that final push really pushed us over the line in terms of our registration count, for sure.
And within that, was that SDR driven or was that coming from marketing?
That came from our HubSpot instance. So we actually marketing run that. And at the same time, we had SDRs promoting the webinar, both through their pre-existing outreach to customers that they're already working on in our ICP and in our tier 1 account list. And they also proactively reached out to customers that they may have spoken to before, or people that were closed lost, or sort of other cohorts of customers that weren't engaged directly through marketing.
Very interesting. And was that a combination of phone, email, and social as they would traditionally reach out, or was it primarily email driven?
It was primarily email driven. We did have the SDRs and other members of the company post about the webinar on their social media across LinkedIn. We also shared it on our regular company channels like Twitter, Facebook, and so forth, but it was predominantly driven by SDR outreach through email.
Cool. And when we start to look at kind of the conversion rate that you saw from the people that you were targeting to the number of registrants that you were able to drive, what type of conversion rates were you seeing?
Yeah, so in terms of our email open rates and our click-through rates, we were looking at something like about a 2% conversion rate from our emails to registration, which doesn't seem super high at the face of it, but we also want to bear in mind that our email list is quite substantial. It's over 50,000 people, and it was also a very broadly relevant campaign. So we weren't necessarily trying to appeal to every customer. It was really just a sort of a first go at it. So we were actually quite happy with that. In terms of the conversion rate from the actual registration to attendance at the webinar, we actually saw a fairly strong turnout of around 1/3 of the registrants, which we thought was pretty good. At least from webinars that I've run in the past, you sometimes get maybe a couple of people showing up. So we definitely had strong interest. And beyond that, we actually had over 20 questions in that webinar as well, which was excellent. I think one of the things that really struck me with this and why we're sort of doubling down on it is because you look at the registrants that are there at the start of the webinar and you look at the registrants at the end, and I'd say, I don't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, but it was about 75% of the registrants that were at the start retained to the end of the webinar. So we definitely had a very sort of sticky cohort of users that were with us in that particular virtual event.
Yeah, that's awesome. And was there anything in particular that you did in the webinar to help drive engagement, or was that not just organic and the interest of people in the topic?
So there are a couple of aspects to that. The first thing is we did have our CEO on this webinar, and I think that sort of helped drive attendance initially because people were sort of able to get sort of the truth spoken from the very top. I think the other part of this was that we really continue to drive people towards Q&A. So we actually called it out in the chat function of Zoom. We encourage people to ask questions, and because we put the Q&A at the end and really gave people the opportunity to have their questions answered live, I think that acted as a sort of a driver for people to stick around, if you like.
That makes sense. And once we got people onto the webinar, a strong attendance within the webinar itself, what did you see from a conversion from registrant to opportunity?
Yeah, so in terms of our registrations through to opportunity, we actually saw a fairly minimal number. I mean, I'd say we had maybe 11 or 12 opportunities created out of the webinar. But the thing to bear in mind here is that a lot of accounts that attended actually had multiple employees attend. So we had government accounts, for example, that had as many as 5 or 6 different employees from the same account. So in that respect, as far as I'm concerned, sort of the conversion rate from attendance or registration through to opportunities is less important. I'm more interested in sort of what is the macro impact of this in terms of pipeline value. And I think that's where we really landed quite successfully, given that we spent very minimal money on this to sort of drive 300K a pipe out of one webinar was for us a hugely impactful event. Yep,
no, absolutely. And that, I think you can look at numbers any number of ways. And I think the way that you're approaching that makes sense and is ultimately revenue is that ultimate golden nugget or ultimate thing that we want to optimize for. Now,
sure.
You mentioned from a cost per sign up perspective, and having used your own email list, I think there's very little cost associated with that aspect of things, but talk to us about the other channels that you were using and what costs were associated on that side of things.
Yeah, so the only paid advertising we ran was across Facebook and LinkedIn through metadata.io. And we actually ran a prospecting campaign to test whether the broad nature of the webinar would appeal to people who hadn't heard of Labelbox before. And my expectation around that was that it probably wouldn't work super well. And I was right. It didn't work that well. I think we ended up with maybe 20 registrations or something from that. And those registrations were around $115 each in the aggregate when you consider both Facebook and LinkedIn. So a little more than we would have liked. At the same time, we did boost the registration count a little more, and at least 2 of those paid registrations actually converted to opportunities. So on that basis, wow, it looked pretty good. However, the rest of the registrations were driven by organic and email sources. So that obviously cut down on cost.
Yep. And when you mentioned it's a little bit higher, but when you think about your kind of traditional retargeting or even more traditional warmer targeting that you're doing through metadata, how does that cost on a cold list compared to that warmer targeting?
Yeah, so I mean, we actually ran a retargeting campaign for a subsequent webinar, which actually kicked off this morning, and we actually saw costs decrease significantly when we just used a retargeting list. In fact, From Facebook alone, our CPL was more around the $50 mark. So more than a 50% reduction. So I think the takeaway for us there is, if you're going to run a webinar, make sure it's to people that have some awareness of your brand and your company. And that, in my mind, makes complete sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I know this webinar was only in April, so it might be too early to attribute any revenue influence, but have you had any opportunities that have closed off of the webinar?
We actually have. We've had 2 opportunities close off the webinar. I don't have the exact values at hand, but we have seen some success there. Around 40% of the pipeline value is still sitting inactive though. So given our deal length and given that we're sort of selling a B2B product that usually takes a good couple of months to close, we expect that to sort of come to fruition in due course. Obviously, there's also the COVID situation as well. So we'll see how that pans out in the longer term.
Cool. Well, thank you, Matthew. This has been fantastic. If people want to connect with you offline, what's the best way to get in touch?
LinkedIn's the best. I hang out there a lot. I'm relatively active. Just go to type in MJ Hammon, MJHAMMON, and connect with me there. Or drop me an email, matthew@labelbox.com.
Cool. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alex.
I hope you enjoyed another unfluffy episode of the Show Me the Data podcast. If you want to become part of our community with other demand gen leaders and get exclusive access to Q&As with the guests we have on the show, click the link in the description of the podcast.